Lost Nazis didn't understand how an Egyptian doctor saved Jewish lives by lying right under their noses. Mohamed Helmy. Dr. Mohamed Helmy signed the medical certificate with the precision of someone who had practiced German handwriting for 15 years in Berlin's most prestigious hospitals. Each letter formed so exactly that it left no room for doubt or questioning. It certified that the patient in front of him, officially identified as Nadia Ibrahim, was suffering from advanced acute pulmonary tuberculosis and required immediate quarantine under constant medical supervision in his private clinic. He knew that the two Gestapo officers waiting in the reception area of his office had come specifically to arrest this woman, because their meticulous records identified her as Anna Boros, a 21-year-old Hungarian Jew whose entire family had been arrested and deported 3 weeks earlier during one of the mass raids that were systematically emptying Berlin of its Jewish population. He knew that the certificate he had just produced in official blue ink was completely false from beginning to end, because Anna was perfectly healthy, without the slightest symptom of tuberculosis or any other illness. And he knew with absolute certainty that if the Nazi officers uncovered his elaborate deception, he, an Egyptian Muslim doctor who had dedicated his life to medicine and the Hippocratic Oath, would be arrested immediately, tortured to reveal others he had helped, and finally executed for the crime of protecting Jews in direct violation of the Reich's racial laws. "Fräulein Ibrahim," he said loudly and clearly, calculated so that the Gestapo officers outside in the reception room could hear every word through the partially open door of his office. "Your pulmonary condition is extremely critical and has deteriorated significantly since your last visit 2 weeks ago. I will require that you remain here under my constant and direct medical observation. Tuberculosis at its current stage is highly contagious and poses a grave danger to anyone who comes into contact with you." Anna looked at him with eyes that held barely contained absolute terror, because she had seen with her own eyes her mother and 2 younger sisters brutally loaded into cattle cars 3 weeks earlier during the mass deportations. And she knew with horrible precision what it meant to be arrested by the Gestapo. She had heard the increasingly insistent rumors about camps in the East where Jews vanished without a trace. Heavy German boots approached the office door with a threatening rhythm, the metallic sound that had become the soundtrack of terror for millions across occupied Europe. Oberscharführer Heinrich Schneider entered without knocking, as was his arrogant habit with anyone he considered racially inferior. A man around 35, with an angular face that looked carved from granite and not the slightest trace of human empathy, a prominent scar running vertically down his left cheek from eye to jaw as a permanent reminder of some forgotten battle, and a well-documented reputation in resistance circles for particular brutality and sadism, especially toward Jews whom he considered less than human. "Herr Dr. Helmy," he said with mechanical politeness that never reached his cold, steel-gray eyes, "we are looking for a Jewish woman named Anna Boros, born in Budapest in 1921. Our complete and meticulous records indicate she has been a frequent patient of yours over the past years." Mohamed Helmy rose from his chair behind the desk. With deliberately calm movements he had perfected over years of deceiving Nazi officers in situations where a single nervous gesture could reveal guilt. He handed over the freshly signed certificate with a hand that did not tremble, even though his heart was pounding so loudly he was sure everyone in the room could hear it. "Oberscharführer Schneider," he said in a carefully measured tone of professional respect, "I believe there is considerable confusion in your records. This young woman is Nadia Ibrahim, an Egyptian citizen like myself. She has been my patient for approximately 2 years for chronic pulmonary tuberculosis that has progressed into an acute stage in recent weeks." He extended the certificate with a gesture that combined medical authority with apparent cooperation. You can see here the full medical diagnosis, with all technical details. I must respectfully warn you that tuberculosis in its current form is highly contagious and transmitted through the air. If you wish to inspect the patient more closely or interrogate her, you will need appropriate protective masking and must maintain a distance of at least 2 meters to minimize infection risk. Schneider took the certificate with open distrust etched into every line of his face. His eyes scanned the document meticulously, looking for any inconsistency or mistake that might indicate forgery. Mohamed watched him without showing the slightest outward nervousness, while his mind calculated with mathematical precision that if Schneider chose to verify the full hospital records exhaustively, he would inevitably find significant discrepancies. Because Anna Boros had been registered under her real, true name in multiple medical institutions until exactly 4 days earlier, when Mohamed had worked frantically for 36 straight hours, retroactively forging her entire medical history, creating elaborate documentation of an Egyptian patient named Nadia Ibrahim, who had never actually existed. What happened in the next 15 minutes would determine absolutely and irrevocably whether Anna Boros would live to see another sunrise or be dragged onto the death trains that departed daily toward the extermination camps in Poland. But to understand how Mohamed Helmy, an Egyptian Muslim doctor educated at Europe's best medical universities, reached that impossible moment of standing before a Gestapo officer and lying deliberately to his face to save the life of a Jewish woman the Nazis wanted to murder. We have to go back exactly 9 years, to the precise day in September 1935, when he first discovered that being a foreigner in Nazi Germany gave him a unique, exploitable advantage to challenge the genocidal system from inside its own bureaucratic structures. If you want to know the rest of this extraordinary story of deception, courage, and humanity in the middle of absolute horror, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Chapter 1. The Foreign Doctor in the Reich. Mohamed Helmy first arrived in Berlin in September 1922 as an ambitious 23-year-old medical student coming directly from Cairo. At that time, Egypt was still a British protectorate, and opportunities for truly advanced, world-class medical education were extremely limited in the Arab world. Germany offered, without question, the finest and most prestigious medical universities on earth, with a scientific tradition stretching back centuries. He studied with obsessive intensity that impressed even German professors known for brutally high standards. He specialized in urology, completing his medical doctorate in 1929 with the highest distinction, placing him in the top 5% of his class. By 1933, when Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party seized full political power in Germany, Mohamed was already an established, respected physician with a thriving private practice in the Moabit district of Berlin and a prestigious position as a specialist consultant at the Robert Koch Hospital, one of the most important medical institutions in the German capital. The early years of the Nazi regime were a period of constant psychological and practical adjustment for Mohamed, as he watched with growing horror the country he had adopted as a second home transform into a police state obsessed with racial purity. The infamous Nuremberg laws, enacted in September 1935, created a complex and elaborate system of citizenship categories based solely on racial ancestry. Jews were officially classified as non-Aryans and systematically excluded from almost every profession, including medicine. They were forbidden to treat German patients, forced out of hospitals and universities, and stripped of professional licenses they had earned through years of rigorous study. But Egyptians and other Arabs existed in a peculiar, ambiguous gray area within the Nazi racial taxonomy, officially classified as honorary Aryans as a pragmatic decision. because Nazi leaders desperately needed to maintain productive diplomatic relations with Egypt and other strategically important Arab countries in the Middle East. That ambiguous, contradictory classification gave Mohammed a freedom of movement and action that other doctors simply did not have in Nazi Germany. He could legally continue treating Jewish patients when German doctors were strictly forbidden to do so under threat of losing their licenses and facing criminal charges. He could move freely in parts of the city where Jews were increasingly restricted by municipal regulations. He could interact professionally with Nazi officials of all ranks without the automatic suspicion and constant scrutiny faced by other foreigners deemed racially suspect. It was a paradox of invisibility through visibility. His obvious status as an Arab foreigner made him noticeable and memorable. Yet it also placed him outside the intricate surveillance system that monitored, with obsessive detail, every movement of German citizens and Jewish residents. In March 1937, Mohammed first met Anna Boros when she came to his private office with a minor urinary tract infection requiring simple antibiotic treatment. She was a talented 18-year-old Hungarian Jewish medical student who had come to Berlin 2 years earlier specifically to study at Humboldt University, but was now facing imminent expulsion due to increasingly strict racial quotas against Jewish students. "My anatomy professor specifically recommended you," she said nervously, her fingers playing with the edge of her skirt. "He said you still treat Jewish patients when nearly every other German doctor turns us away at the door or treats us with obvious contempt." Mohammed answered with a blunt simplicity that would become his guiding principle. "I treat anyone who genuinely needs medical help. True medicine has no religion, no race, no nationality, only suffering patients and doctors who have sworn to relieve that suffering." In the following months, Anna became a regular patient of Mohammed, not because she was particularly ill, but because the doctor's office gradually became one of the few safe places where Jews could speak freely without the constant, paralyzing fear that dominated every moment of their lives outside. Mohammed listened to her stories with rising horror and controlled rage. Anna's once prosperous family had lost their textile import business, confiscated without compensation by the Nazi state. Her 2 older brothers had been brutally beaten in the street by SA thugs, while German bystanders watched passively without intervening. She herself had been spat on multiple times by German students, shouting anti-Semitic insults, while professors looked away and pretended to see nothing. "Honestly, I don't know how much longer we can endure this, Dr. Helmy," she confessed one rainy October afternoon, her voice cracking with restrained emotion. "Every day is worse than the one before. Every week brings new restrictions and humiliations. My parents talk constantly about emigrating, but we have neither money nor connections in other countries." That night, Mohammed made a decision that would irrevocably change the course of his life. He lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling of his apartment. If the Nazi regime was truly determined to systematically destroy every Jew under its control, as the increasingly ominous signs clearly suggested, and if his unique position as an Egyptian doctor gave him specific advantages to help them that German citizens simply did not possess, then he had an absolute moral obligation to act on his deepest principles. It was not an impulsive choice made in a burst of emotion, but a careful calculation of personal risk versus ethical responsibility toward innocent human beings facing systematic persecution. He began studying the Nazi racial laws meticulously, page by page, searching for loopholes and bureaucratic ambiguities he could exploit to protect lives. Chapter 2: The Anatomy of Medical Deception. The legal structure of the Nazi state was paradoxically both brutally efficient in its cruelty and bureaucratically chaotic in practical implementation. There were layers upon layers of regulations, decrees, and directives that often contradicted one another, creating administrative confusion. After months of obsessive study, Mohamed discovered that this very complexity created spaces where carefully constructed, meticulously documented deceptions could thrive undetected. If one understood the system well enough, the absolute key was understanding the Nazi bureaucratic mindset so completely that he could manipulate it without being caught. They trusted official-looking paperwork that seemed correct at a glance because their entire ideology was built on order, hierarchy, and meticulous record-keeping. His first act of medical forgery was relatively simple and low risk, a test of the system. A 52-year-old Jewish patient named Herr Goldstein desperately needed an official certificate declaring him physically unfit for heavy manual labor. To avoid being sent to a work camp where brutal conditions routinely killed workers within weeks, Mohamed created a completely false diagnosis of severe chronic heart disease. Backed by electrocardiograms, he carefully forged, using traces from real patients with arrhythmias. The certificate was accepted without the slightest question, because Mohamed had spent years establishing an impeccable professional reputation for medical competence and diagnostic precision. The surprising success of that first, smaller deception revealed a fundamental principle Mohamed would exploit for years. The Nazis trusted established medical authority because their ideology was pathologically obsessed with health, racial hygiene, and biological purity. A respected physician who could produce convincing medical documentation using proper technical language held significant power over bureaucratic decisions. Mohamed began exploiting that systematically with growing sophistication. Certificates for contagious diseases like tuberculosis were especially effective because the Nazis had a near pathological fear of contamination and preferred to keep their distance from anyone potentially infectious. By mid-1938, Mohamed had developed a full system for producing false medical documentation with clockwork precision. He discreetly stole blank official medical forms from Robert Koch Hospital, where he still worked as a respected specialist consultant. He practiced the signatures of prominent German doctors until he could replicate them perfectly. He created elaborate, entirely fictional patient histories dated years back, providing verifiable consistency for any inspection. Every forged certificate was backed by multiple layers of cross-referenced paperwork, making it extraordinarily difficult for any investigator to detect fraud without weeks of exhaustive verification, something that rarely happened due to massive bureaucratic workload. The risk escalated dramatically during Kristallnacht in November 1938, the coordinated night of terror when synagogues were burned and Jewish businesses smashed across Germany while police stood by under orders not to intervene. Mohamed watched from his apartment window with absolute horror and helpless rage as buildings burned, lighting the night sky. The next day, dozens of badly beaten Jews flooded his office, desperate for treatment because German hospitals turned them away automatically. Mohamed treated every one of them without exception, documenting their obvious injuries as domestic accidents or falls downstairs to protect them from further persecution by authorities looking for excuses for additional arrests. Among the injured that terrible week was Jakob Boros, Anna's 54-year-old father, arbitrarily arrested during the riots and severely beaten with police batons before being released without charges, simply to terrorize him. "They will deport us eventually, Dr. Helmy," Jakob said with grim certainty born of seeing the genocidal logic behind Nazi policy. "It's only a matter of time before they arrest us all. We desperately need to get out of Germany, but we have neither money nor connections abroad." Mohamed solemnly promised to help the family, though he honestly did not yet know how. That promise pushed him to expand his operations far beyond occasional forged certificates into something larger and far more dangerous. Something that would require a network. Chapter 3. A network of paper and complicity. Mohamed methodically built a clandestine web of contacts that would ultimately save dozens of lives during the war's darkest years. His position as a respected doctor gave him natural access to people across multiple layers of German society. He treated patients ranging from ordinary workers to lower-ranking regime officials. Every professional encounter was evaluated as a potential opportunity. Who could be recruited as an active collaborator, and who could be bribed or nudged into looking away at critical moments? His most important ally became Frieda Sturman, a dedicated 50-year-old German nurse with 3 decades of experience, who worked in the records department at IA, Robert Koch Hospital. She shared Mohamed's moral revulsion toward Nazi policies, though she never voiced it publicly out of justified fear. My eldest son died in the trenches during the First World War. She confided one night after a brutal shift in which they treated a Jewish boy beaten by Hitler Youth thugs. He died at 19, supposedly fighting for Germany and German values. And now these Nazi criminals spit on his memory and everything he stood for by brutalizing completely innocent people whose only crime is being born Jewish. Frieda had privileged access to hospital records and began actively helping Mohamed retroactively forge medical histories that looked authentic even under careful inspection, inserting false documents directly into the official system where they were nearly impossible to detect. The second crucial contact was Ernst Hartmann, a meticulous 42-year-old clerk at the Ministry of the Interior who processed hundreds of identity documents and citizenship certificates each day. Mohamed had treated him for months for painful chronic ulcers and, during private consultations, noticed subtle signs of moral discontent with the regime. "I process literally hundreds of applications a day," Ernst said during one particularly emotional appointment. "I see entire families separated and destroyed. Children officially labeled non-Aryan because they have one Jewish grandparent. People losing everything over fractions of blood. It's absolute madness disguised as science." Mohamed cultivated the relationship carefully for months, never pressuring him. Eventually, Ernst began making administrative errors in racial classifications, bureaucratic mistakes that mysteriously turned Jews into Aryans in official paperwork, or classified Jews as foreign nationals of neutral countries. By late 1939, when Germany had invaded Poland and World War II had begun, Mohamed had developed a meticulous 3-step process to help Jews escape Germany, or at least survive within it. First, he created entirely false identities supported by elaborate medical documentation explaining any potential discrepancy in appearance or behavior. A Jewish woman became, on paper, an Egyptian suffering from a rare neurological condition that explained why she did not speak Arabic perfectly. A Jewish man became, officially, an Italian with a chronic medical condition requiring specialized treatment available only in Berlin. Second, Frieda inserted these wholly fictional medical histories retroactively into hospital records, creating a verifiable history dating back years. Third, Ernst processed official identity papers based on those now existing records in the government system. The system worked remarkably well for nearly 2 years without detection. Mohamed conservatively estimated he had helped around 30 people by September 1941. Some managed to leave Germany entirely, using false identities to cross borders into neutral countries. Others survived in Berlin under new names, working jobs forbidden to Jews. Every operation required weeks of careful planning, because a single small mistake would mean not only the person's death, but the exposure of the entire network and the execution of every collaborator. The case that affected him most emotionally during that period was David and Sarah Rothstein, an elderly couple in their late 60s who had been stripped of their business and forced from their apartment into an overcrowded ghetto. Mohamed transformed them into Davide and Sara Rossini, an Italian couple who had supposedly come to Berlin for specialized medical treatment. He created an elaborate history of fictional cardiac treatment for Sarah, requiring constant supervision. Frida inserted the records into the hospital system. Ernst processed complete Italian documents with appropriate seals and signatures. The Rothsteins survived the war under their false identities, and later wrote to Mohamed from Tel Aviv after emigrating. "You gave us not only papers, but the real hope that basic humanity still existed in the world. We will never forget your courage as long as we live." Chapter 4. The Forest Cabin Refuge. In 1942, as mass deportations intensified and trains packed with Jews began leaving daily to the east, Mohamed knew with grim certainty that forged medical certificates would no longer be enough. Raids were capturing even genuinely sick people who should have been hospitalized. He urgently needed a physical hiding place, somewhere people could disappear entirely from the Nazi surveillance system. The unexpected solution came from a circumstance that felt almost providential. Mohamed owned a small wooden cabin in Buch, a quiet rural suburb about 20 kilometers north of central Berlin. He had bought it in 1938 as a weekend retreat from the stress of his practice and the oppressive atmosphere of the city. The cabin sat in a relatively isolated area surrounded by dense pine forest, with the nearest neighbors almost a kilometer away. It had a small but solid cellar that Mohamed decided to convert into a habitable hideout. For weeks, mostly at night, he worked methodically, adding improvised ventilation through carefully concealed ducts, stockpiling non-perishable supplies, installing an oil lamp for light without electricity that could be detected, and creating a clever entrance hidden behind a heavy bookshelf that looked permanently fixed in place. The Boros family became the first long-term residents of the hidden cellar in March 1942. Anna, now 25, her mother Cecilia, 52, and her younger sister Julie, 17. The father, Jakob, had been arrested suddenly in January during a night raid and deported immediately to an unknown camp in the east, without even the chance to say goodbye. "My father made me swear before they took him that I would protect my mother and sister no matter what," Anna said, her voice breaking as tears ran down her cheeks. "I can't fail him. He sacrificed everything for us." Mohamed promised, with absolute sincerity, to keep them safe as long as he had breath in his body. The three women lived in that claustrophobic cellar for nearly 3 years, in conditions Mohamed could only imagine were psychologically torturous. Existence narrowed to biological survival. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. The cellar was barely 4 meters by 3, with a low ceiling that made standing difficult. A tiny ground-level window provided minimal natural light for a few hours a day. The space was brutally cold during Berlin winters that routinely dropped below freezing and suffocatingly hot during summers. Keeping 3 people completely hidden was a constant logistical challenge. Mohamed used his official medical rations to obtain extra food without raising suspicion. He brought books so they could keep their minds active and avoid sinking into despair. He brought medicine when they fell ill, frequently, given poor conditions. He brought carefully chosen war news to give them hope that the regime would eventually collapse. Every time we heard the distinctive sound of his car approaching along the forest path, Anna later recalled, it was as if life returned to our bodies, because it meant the outside world had not completely forgotten us. The most terrifying moment came in August 1943. when curious neighbors reported suspicious activity around the cabin, supposedly unoccupied. 2 uniformed police officers arrived without warning. By chance, Mohamed was there that day bringing weekly provisions. He greeted them with calculated hospitality. "Officers, what a pleasant surprise. I was just making fresh coffee. Would you like to join me?" He invited them inside with a genuine smile, showed them the entire cabin except the cellar, whose entrance was perfectly hidden behind the heavy medical bookshelf. He chatted with them for almost an hour about trivialities, weather, the war, while directly beneath their feet, 3 women held their breath, terrified, listening to every word. The officers left satisfied that nothing suspicious was happening. Mohamed waited until their vehicle was completely out of sight, then carefully opened the hidden entrance. He found the 3 women silently crying with sheer relief, clinging to one another. "We honestly thought this was the end," Cecilia said, her voice still shaking. "We heard every word. When one of them casually mentioned checking the cellar, I thought my heart would explode." Mohamed hugged them. "As long as I am alive and have any power at all, you are safe. I swear it." Chapter 5. The Tuberculosis Certificate. By early 1944, it was painfully obvious, even to optimists, that Germany was losing the war. Paradoxically, the Gestapo intensified its desperate effort to find and deport Jews still hidden in Berlin. They compiled extraordinarily detailed lists of missing persons from municipal records and investigated every known contact. Anna Boros was prominent on one high-interest list because she had been a registered university student. The Gestapo knew she had been Mohamed's patient and would inevitably come to interrogate him. Mohamed prepared for that moment for weeks. He created a brand new, elaborate medical history for Anna under the name Nadia Ibrahim, documenting a fictional tuberculosis treatment dating back to 1941. He inserted real chest X-rays from a truly tubercular patient into the file, labeling them with Anna's false name. He forged lab results showing tuberculosis bacteria in sputum. He wrote detailed notes documenting regular visits for 3 years. Every detail was built to withstand intense scrutiny. Because he knew when the Gestapo came, the lie had to be flawless, or everyone would die. The confrontation came exactly as he expected on March 18, 1944. Oberscharführer, or Heinrich Schneider, and another officer arrived, demanding information on Anna Boros's whereabouts. Mohamed responded with perfectly acted confusion. "Anna Boros? No. There must be some administrative error in your records. I have an Egyptian patient named Nadia Ibrahim you may be confusing." Schneider showed an official photo of Anna from her university papers. Mohamed studied it as if trying to remember, then nodded. "Ah, yes. This is definitely Nadia Ibrahim, an Egyptian citizen. She has been my patient for years for chronic pulmonary tuberculosis that has unfortunately progressed." Schneider wasn't convinced. "Our official Interior Ministry records specifically state this woman is Anna Boros, a Hungarian Jew born in Budapest, last seen in your practice in February 1942, just before the mass deportations." Mohamed remained perfectly composed. "Oberscharführer, with full respect to your records, which I'm sure are generally accurate, in this specific case, they are wrong. I can show you her complete medical file dating back to 1941. He retrieved the thick file, page after page of detailed medical notes, x-rays, lab results. Entirely forged, yet indistinguishable from authentic documentation. Schneider examined everything with growing frustration. Each time he thought he'd found a contradiction, Mohamed produced a technical medical explanation supported by further paperwork. The chest X-rays clearly show advanced bilateral pulmonary tuberculosis, Mohamed said, pointing with a pen and using precise terminology. You can see the characteristic cavitary lesions in the upper lobes of both lungs. This is not something that can be faked. Schneider didn't understand the images, but he was intimidated by medical authority. Finally, he demanded to see the patient in person to interrogate her. Of course you may see her, Mohamed said calmly. But I must warn you that pulmonary tuberculosis is extremely contagious and transmitted through the air. You will need appropriate protective masking and must maintain at least 2 meters distance. Also, the patient is currently in a specialized quarantine facility for public health reasons. That was a lie inside a lie. Anna was safe in the forest cabin. But the mere mention of a highly contagious disease made Schneider visibly hesitate. The Nazis had a near pathological fear of contagious illness. Schneider asked, uncomfortable, where the quarantine facility was. Mohamed gave the address of a real Berlin clinic that treated tuberculosis patients. He knew that if Schneider checked, he would find Nadia Ibrahim registered, because Frida had inserted the false records into the hospital system the week before, precisely for this moment. You may verify directly with the clinic administration, Mohamed said confidently. But I again warn you about the infection risk if you insist on close proximity. Chapter 6. The Mask of Medical. Authorities Schneider decided to visit the tuberculosis clinic immediately, without notice. Mohamed accompanied him, knowing this was the most dangerous moment, where the entire elaborate structure could collapse. Everything depended on whether Frida had executed her part perfectly. At the clinic, Mohamed formally requested Nadia Ibrahim's records. The receptionist checked and confirmed that a patient by that name was indeed registered, admitted 3 weeks earlier with a diagnosis of acute bilateral pulmonary tuberculosis. I want to see the patient right now, Schneider insisted. Mohamed nodded and requested protective masks according to medical protocol. While they waited, Mohamed spoke casually about tuberculosis. Historically, it kills roughly 40% of untreated patients. It's particularly dangerous because it spreads through the air. One cough can infect everyone in a room. That's why quarantine protocols are strict. When the white masks arrived, Schneider looked at them with obvious discomfort. Mohamed saw the hesitation and exploited it. Oberscharführer, if you prefer for your personal safety, I can coordinate bringing the patient for formal interrogation once she is well enough. Her current condition makes interrogation nearly impossible. She can barely finish a sentence without severe coughing fits producing bloody sputum. The graphic detail had the intended effect. Schneider recoiled, visibly disgusted. How long until she's recovered enough for proper interrogation? He asked. Mohamed calculated the time he needed to buy. With appropriate treatment, at least 6 full weeks, possibly up to 3 months. Tuberculosis is not a disease that resolves quickly. Schneider considered, then nodded. Very well. But I want detailed weekly medical reports. And when she is well enough, she will be interrogated by the Gestapo without exception. Mohamed agreed immediately, because it bought time. After Schneider left, Mohamed went straight to Frida. We need to keep this fiction alive for at least 3 months, he said quietly. That means weekly reports showing slow improvement for a patient who doesn't exist. Frida nodded. I can do that. A few weekly reports are no problem. The unspoken question was what would happen when Schneider eventually insisted on seeing the patient. Mohamed had been obsessing over it. By then, with luck, the military situation will have changed, he said, sounding desperate even to himself. It was March 1944. The Western Allies were preparing a massive invasion of France. The Soviets were advancing from the east. Mohamed was betting lives that the Reich would collapse before he had to produce Anna in person. Over the following weeks, Mohamed produced detailed reports documenting Nadia Ibrahim's gradual recovery, each week showing marginal improvement, slow enough to justify continued quarantine. Schneider accepted them, with mounting frustration, but he couldn't contradict medical authority backed by such professional documentation. Each passing week was another week of life for Anna and her family. Chapter 7. The Collapse of the Reich. On June 6, 1944, the Western Allies landed on the beaches of Normandy, beginning the liberation of Western Europe. Mohamed heard the news on his radio with euphoria he had to conceal. Celebrating openly would have been treason. He knew the end was near, yet the final months would be the most dangerous. The Nazis grew more desperate, more violent, more unpredictable as their world collapsed. Summary executions of traitors increased weekly. He went to the cabin to tell Anna and her family, "The Allies have landed in France. This is the beginning of the end. You only have to endure a little longer." The three women cried openly, relief mixed with years of stored tension. They had lived more than 2 years in that cellar. Darkness, hunger, paralyzing fear. "How much longer do we have to stay hidden?" Julie asked. Mohamed couldn't give certainty. Months, certainly. Possibly a year. "But I swear you will survive. You've come too far to fail now." Schneider continued demanding reports, but Mohamed noticed his attention fragmenting as the Eastern Front crept toward Berlin. By December 1944, Mohamed reported that the patient had been discharged, but required intensive home treatment, still potentially contagious, and that interrogation should wait until infection risk was gone. In January 1945, Schneider abruptly stopped asking for reports at all. The Nazi bureaucracy was collapsing. Gestapo officers were increasingly focused on their own survival. Mohamed took every precaution, stockpiling food and water, preparing evacuation plans, ensuring the women knew routes to Allied lines if something happened to him. On May 2, 1945, Berlin finally surrendered to the Soviet Red Army after a brutal battle that reduced much of the city to rubble. Mohamed went to the cabin, scarcely believing it. He opened the hidden cellar door and, for the first time in nearly 3 years, told them, voice trembling, "You can come out now. The war is over. You are safe." Anna emerged first, blinking painfully in bright sunlight she had not seen in years. Cecilia followed, moving stiffly on atrophied muscles. Then Julie. The three embraced, crying, while Mohamed watched with a satisfaction no human honor could ever match. Days later, Mohamed brought Anna back into devastated Berlin to register with Allied authorities. They passed his clinic, partly destroyed during the final battle. Anna stopped, overwhelmed. "Everything began here," she said softly. "When I came as a terrified young patient and you chose to help me. You saved my life so many times, I've lost count." Chapter 8. Dr. Helmy's complicated legacy. After the war, Mohamed tried to return to normal life, but normal no longer existed. Berlin was in ruins. His practice was damaged. His position at Robert Koch Hospital disappeared in post-war restructuring. Worse, as an Egyptian citizen, he was bureaucratically classified as an enemy foreigner by occupation authorities. An absurdity after everything he had risked. Anna and her family emigrated to the United States in 1946, seeking a new beginning. Before leaving, Anna wrote a detailed testimony of how Mohamed had saved them. Dr. Mohamed Helmy repeatedly risked his own life for years to protect us. Without his selfless help and extraordinary courage, my mother, my sister, and I would certainly have been murdered in the extermination camps, like my father Jakob and so many millions of others. We owe him our lives, and we will never forget. Mohamed remained in Berlin for decades, slowly rebuilding his practice, mostly treating poor patients. He never sought publicity and rejected the title of hero. True medicine has no religion or nationality, he would say when pressed. My Hippocratic oath was to help the sick and protect the persecuted. I simply fulfilled my professional duty. The truth was more complex than his humility suggested. He had personally saved around 50 people through a combination of meticulous medical forgeries, dangerous physical hiding places, and brilliant manipulation of the Nazi bureaucratic system. For most of the war, he operated essentially alone. Aside from key collaborators like Frieda and Ernst, he was not part of a large organized resistance network. He was a lone figure who used his unique position as an Egyptian doctor to exploit every loophole. His method was not the glamorous heroism of explosives or sabotage, but perfectly executed deception, forged papers, technical language, and the calculated exploitation of Nazi fear of contagious disease. He understood that the Nazis were both violently ruthless and pathologically afraid of biological contamination. A tuberculosis certificate could be more powerful than a weapon. In 1960, Anna returned to Berlin with her American husband and children to visit Mohamed. She had built a new life, becoming a respected literature professor and raising 3 healthy children. "My children exist only because you saved me," she told him through tears. "Every day I thank God for your courage, when it would have been safer to look away." Mohamed answered with characteristic humility, "I wasn't especially brave, Anna. I simply could not stand by while innocent people were murdered." Mohamed Helmy died in 1982 at the age of 82. A brief obituary mentioned almost casually that he had helped some Jews during the war, without capturing the true scope. After his death, Anna wrote to Yad Vashem in Jerusalem to nominate him as righteous among the nations. "Dr. Helmy saved my life and my family's lives at tremendous personal risk. He must be remembered." The recognition process was complicated. Helmy was an Egyptian Muslim. There was no clear precedent. Some of his actions, like systematic forgery of medical documents, technically violated professional protocols, even though they were morally justified. Debate continued for years. Finally, in 2013, almost 30 years after his death, Yad Vashem formally recognized Mohamed Helmy as righteous among the nations, historically the first Arab Muslim to receive the honor. Anna had died in 2003 and did not live to see the recognition she fought for. But her 3 adult children traveled to Jerusalem to accept the award posthumously. "Our mother never forgot that Dr. Helmy saved her life repeatedly," they said. "She dedicated much of her life to ensuring his story was remembered, that the world would know an Egyptian Muslim doctor risked everything to save Jews when so many others looked away." The Nazis never truly understood how an Egyptian doctor had systematically saved Jewish lives by lying under their noses for years, because they could not imagine someone using their own obsessive bureaucracy against them so effectively. Could not imagine that meticulously forged medical certificates could be more powerful than weapons. That one man armed with intelligence, perfectly executed documents, and unbreakable moral determination could defy them for years without detection. Mohamed Helmy proved that effective resistance against evil does not always require spectacular violence or large numbers. Sometimes it requires a single, exceptional individual with unique skills, a strategic position, and extraordinary moral courage. someone willing to use every advantage against a system built on cruelty. His lasting legacy is not monuments or battles, but the roughly 50 people who lived when they were meant to die, the hundreds of descendants who exist today, and the permanent reminder that even in the darkest times, seemingly ordinary people can choose to do something extraordinary.